Oh, wow. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida. Thanks for taking the time to watch another presentation. I really appreciate that. So today we're going to be discussing the Rastafari movement, its origins, and its founders. There's a lot of Rastas that don't even know the origin or the founders of the whole movement. Before I begin today, I just want to say I was many years in the Rastafari culture. Why did I relate? And you guys are going to see today mostly because of the idea of resisting colonial powers and standing up for the oppressed and being righteous, because all that sounded good to me. There was many Rastas in the neighborhood I grew up in, many Jamaican and Caribbean people with the whole Rasta influence. And not just in Boston, but in Costa Rica as well. It's very big. You guys are going to see that Costa Rica plays a large role when it comes to the founders here of Rastafarianism. I do hope that we can let go of our personal biases and beliefs, because beliefs and facts are two different things. I hope you can be logical, see the information for what it is, and then make your own conclusions based on that information, not personal opinions and beliefs. The whole thing was Afrocentric, literally created by Pan-Africanists. Hope after today's video, you guys will see that there is a trend when it comes to these movements that were started in the 1920s, 1900s by these so-called black leaders. They all have similar backgrounds and beliefs and agendas. And this is not a random coincidence. So today we're going to read a lot, and we're going to read it from their own Rasta scholars who wrote books. You guys are going to see the origin of this movement, of the Rastafari, Afrocentric movements. So some of you may take this like I'm bashing Rastas and stuff like that. That's not the intent of this. I'm actually doing this to try to help you and inform you on things you might have not thought about or knew. If you've been following me for a while, you already know this whole Afrocentric Pan-African movements are all hijacks. We're in 2023. It's got to be facts over feelings. You got to break out of these belief systems and biases and start going with facts, historical facts. You guys will see how it's very similar to all the other movements that were created in the 1920s to separate you from your land and your true genealogy, your true heritage, your true bloodline. Hope you enjoy the presentation. Thanks for tuning in once again. I'm going to read from this book right now. It's called Leonard Percival Howell and the Genesis of Rastafari, edited by Clinton A. Houghton, Michael A. Barnett, D.A. Dunkley, and Jalani A.H. Nia. So right away, I just want you to know, I'm going to read from the Rastafari people themselves. They wrote this. We're going to get their perspective and version of Leonard Percival and the origin of Rastafari. And of course, in the cover, you got Marcus Garvey. If you haven't seen my Marcus Garvey videos, make sure to check them out. And I hope you don't practice cognitive dissonance while viewing the information. It's most high over everything, including people. Just wanted to say that. Apart from that, we're going to see right away, and they're going to tell you in this book right away, it has been a Pan-Africanist movement since its creation. And we already debunked all that, so. Introduction. The arrival of this cross-disciplinary volume on Leonard Howell and the early years of the Rastafari movement is a welcome addition to the growing literature on Rastafari studies. Robert Hill's 1981 article was the first academic study on Howell to be published. It was republished in 1983 in the Jamaica Journal and has been available since 2001. As a short monograph, Dread History, Leonard P. Howell, and Millenarian Visions in the Early Rastafarian Religion. Other studies since then include the works written by Michael Hoenisch and Frank Jan van Dijk, published in the Massachusetts Review and New West Indian Guide, respectively, in Rastafari Roots and Ideology. Barry Shivani's, the noted Rastafari scholar, included a chapter, Early Leaders and Organizations, in which, among other things, he gave sketches of the personalities and leadership and organizational styles of Leonard Howell, Joseph Hibbard, Archibald Dunkey, and Robert Hines, founders of the Rastafari movement, all right? The book Chanting Down Babylon, The Rastafari Reader, also has a chapter titled The First Chant, Leonard Howell's The Promise Key, with commentary by William David Spencer. Louis E.A. Moisten has also been publishing newspaper and online articles on Howell since the 1980s. In addition, Helene Lee's book, the only published biography of Howell entitled The First Rasta, Leonard Howell and the Rise of Rastafarianism, was originally a 1999 French publication that was republished in English in 2003. These studies shed light on Howell's role as a foundational Rastafari leader and his persecution by the colonial and post-colonial states. The next generation of studies on Howell and early Rastafari was inspired by the 2011 University of the West Indies Symposium on Leonard Percival Howell to commemorate the 113th year of his birth. It is within this context that D.A. Dunkley published two articles, one in Caribbean Quarterly and the other in New West Indian Guide. The articles and other contributions in the present volume seek not only to build on this body of work, but also to provide a diverse collection of opinions about Howell published in one place. Importantly, not only does the array of contributions, speeches, essays, and interview with Howell's sons that has been compiled for this volume provide provocative perspectives on Leonard Howell, but it also gives us a fairly detailed glimpse of the early years of the Rastafari movement, an area in need of more attention in Rastafari studies. The present volume is therefore the product of interest in Howell and the genesis of the Rastafari movement. Also worth noting is that the volume was conceived and compiled by Rastafari scholars, right, by its own people, three of whom are Rastafari practitioners, from a range of disciplines including politics, philosophy, sociology, history, and cultural studies, thus assuring that the volume stands as an authentic representation of the Rastafari family and a cross-disciplinary contribution to Rastafari scholarship. It says here the first chapter of this volume, written by political scientist and philosopher Clinton Hutton, explores the genesis of Rastafari through the prism of Garveyism. Revivalism. What is revivalism? It says here on the Britannica.com, says revivalism is Christianity. Revivalism generally renewed religious fervor within a Christian group, church, or community, but primarily a movement in some Protestant churches to revitalize the spiritual ardor of their members and to win new adherents. Revivalism in its modern form can be attributed to that shared emphasis in Anabaptism, Puritanism, German Pietism, and Methodism in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries on personal religious experience, the priesthood of all believers, and holy living, in protest against established church systems that seemed excessively sacramental, priestly, and worldly. Of central importance, however, was the emphasis on personal conversion. So it included a prism of Garveyism. We know what that means, all right, in the previous videos. That's all Pan-African stuff. Back to Africa movements, black versus white, crayon colors. And then we got revivalism, we just read. And then there's Mayalism. What is Mayalism? It says here Mayal. Mayal is an Afro-Jamaican spirituality, really Afro. It developed via the creolization of African religions during the slave era in Jamaica. So that's when you believe in the African slave trade. We've already debunked all that. So what is all this spirituality really coming from? It incorporates ritualistic magic, spiritual possession, and dancing. Unlike Obia, it practices focus more on the connection of spirits with humans. Over time, Mayal began to meld with Christian practices and created the religious tradition known as revivalism, okay? See what it became? Is it really from Africans or with French or Black Europeans incorporating the indigenous practices and making it into ritualistic magic, talking about and turning into Christian practices known as revivalism? Just something to think about. Future videos. Now it's also going to mention Kumina as one of the influences for Rastafari. And again, Afro-Jamaican Dashta Kumina has practices that include secular ceremonies, dance, and music that develop from the beliefs and traditions brought to the island by. So that's not by Congo, maybe by Brazilian slaves, maybe from out South America or Central America, and then some influence by French and all that. And this is why I'm saying that. It says history, Kumina emerged through the practices of indentured laborers. I thought it was African slaves who were brought to Jamaica from the Congo region of Central Africa. Do you guys see that? Now they're telling us that Africans had contracts. What is an indentured labor? We already know who was being put into these encomiendas. It was American Indians and who? Black Europeans being sent over there as prisoners of war and all that, who were brought to Jamaica. So you see how they just snitched on themselves? So these people had indentures or contracts, huh? So this eventually synchronized with Mayalism. Kumina differed from Zion revivalism in rejecting the belief that the Bible should be the central authority behind worship. Rejecting. They didn't go down with the Bible. Let's go back to the book real quick. Again, so they're gonna explore the genesis of Rastafari through the prism of Garveyism, revivalism, Mayalism, and Kumina. Do you see that? And other expressions of African Caribbean spirituality. Not just African. We're gonna learn a lot today, guys. You're gonna see how much of the Hindu practices are also involved in this. This is part 1 of this book. Chapter 1 says Leonard Howell announcing God. The conditions that gave birth to Rastafari in Jamaica. Clinton A. Houghton. Says here on November 2nd, 1930, Rastafari Makonnen was crowned Haile Selassie I, Emperor of Ethiopia, with titles such as King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Light of Saba, the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah. This was witnessed by world leaders or their representatives and stirred the ontological and imaginative strivings and hopes of people of African descent, Dashta Hijack, all over the world. So again, if you've been following me for a long time, you already know Dashta Hijack. If you're new, keep an open mind. We have debunked this already. We got over 500 presentations in the last 6 years. Make sure to catch up if you're new. So this was like a symbol for freedom, justice, sovereignty, and redemption with catalytic agential force. In Jamaica, the response to the coronation was unique. It led to the birth of an anti-colonial and Africanist movement centered on the divination of Emperor Haile Selassie. All right, it had to be focused on the divination of Haile Selassie, amen, the Emperor of Ethiopia, person that was living. Pan-Africanist movement. So from its birth, this has been a Pan-Africanist movement. This is Rastafari scholars letting you know themselves. We've already debunked the whole Pan-African thing, so this all cancels out. So all these movements were started by single men whose personal history nobody really studied or understood what personal agendas they had. But there's a picture of Leonard Howell right here. The first recorded public expression of the deification of Haile Selassie occurred in January 1933. According to Leonard Percival Howell, who initiated the public display of divination in Kingston, Jamaica, they say he was the first one. We're going to read and learn today. There's a couple people, 3 or 4, that say, no, I was the first one who did it. Howell had lived abroad some 20 years, having migrated to Panama and the United States. He was in Harlem, guys, during the whole Harlem Renaissance with the Garveyisms. After that, he had returned home from the latter in December 1932. The first public expression of deification of Redemption Ground in Kingston was described by P.A. Thompson, one of the attendees, as Howell's first meeting. In any event, Howell's Kingston meeting was not successful, and in February he took his Rastafari meeting to the southeastern parish of St. Thomas. On April 18, 1933, Howell addressed some 200 persons at a meeting in Trinityville at St. Thomas. The police who were present took notes and later submitted a report to the clerk of the courts of statements allegedly made by Howell, which they considered to be of a seditious nature. According to one of the police corporals, all right, this is what he heard, this is what he wrote down. It says, I heard Leonard Howell, the speaker said to the hearers, the line of Judah has broken the chain, and we of the black race, black, so-called black, are now free. George V is no more our king. George V had sent his third son down to Africa in 1928 to bow down to our new king, Rastafari. Rastafari is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The black people must not look to George V as their king anymore. Rastafari is their king. He said, the Negro is now free, and the white people will have to bow to the Negro race. White people have to bow to the Negro race. I'm glad he quoted that because, yes, in the early years, literally part of the movement's origin was to separate yourself from so-called white people. Here we go with the separation by physical appearance and crayon colors. Just like Garvey, just like most Pan-Africans keep doing, and want to call the white man the devil, want to blame everything on the white man. But you know what's ironic and very hypocritical about this, and that's within the Rastafari community, is that there is many white Rastas all over the world. You go to Jamaica, you'll find many of them living with the Rastafari community. Here in Costa Rica, everywhere. The origin was to make white people bow down to the Negro race. At the end of the meeting, he said, you must sing the national anthem, but before you start, you must remember that you are not singing it for King George V, but for Rastafari, our new king. As sympathetic as the Crown Solicitor and the Attorney General might have been with present charges of sedition against Howell, again, we're just getting started in the presentation. We're going to keep reading more books where you're going to see what I'm talking about. It was literally separation from so-called white people. So it's very ironic that a lot of so-called white Rastas exist today all over the world. And again, even in the Rastafari communities, you got them living there, marrying, having babies, taking part in everything. I'm almost certain if Leonard Percival Howell was alive, he would have said, that's not my vision. We were supposed to separate. Because he was like Garvey, he was on something else. Because these people were about crayon colors, black versus white. So talking about white people, right? So-called white people. Everybody knows Bob Marley, right? And we know his influence and assistance he gave to the Rastafari movement to spread all around the world. I'm going to read something to you in case you don't know. All right, Bob Marley, right? It says, Bob Marley was born Nesta Robert Marley in 9 Mile, St. Anne Parish, Jamaica on 6 February 1945 to a 19-year-old village girl, Sadella Booker. Listen, 19-year-old. His father, Norval St. Clair Marley, a white British naval officer who was around 60 years old at the time, met Sadella while working as a supervisor on a plantation. Do you guys hear that? He was 60 years old and she was 19. That's Bob Marley's father. He had a reputation for betting young local women and separated from Sadella shortly after Bob was born, remaining largely absent from his son's life until he died suddenly from a heart attack when Bob was 10. It was Sadella who changed his name to Robert Nesta Marley after a Jamaican immigration officer suggested that Nesta sounded too girlish. All right, again, Bob Marley's dad, so-called white man. This is Captain Norval Marley right here. Okay, and he was younger. You can see the eyes a little bit in Bob Marley. Yeah, this is him right here. This is Bob Marley's dad. In case you've never seen him, I colorized a picture of him that I found online. This is a very good quality, enhanced and everything on his force. Norval Sinclair. Sinclair, right? The Sinclair family. Marley. Here's a little close-up of him. All right, you guys can see. Bob Marley's father. Black and white picture. Here's another version in color. Again, Bob Marley's dad. And I just want to remind everybody what, Hebrew Israelites tell me all the time, that you are what your father is. You are the seed of your father. This is Bob Marley's father. So real quick, I know I got off the book, but I wanted to point that out. That's why we got to break all prejudices. As sympathetic as the Crown Solicitor and the Attorney General might have been with present charges of sedition against Howell, they were concerned that taking such a measure would prove beneficial to a ranter who would revel in the advertisement of a prosecution. The prosecutor's method of suppressing Howell might not be prudent, stated a police report. It would be better, perhaps, if he were guided on a path to the lunatic asylum. Support for the lunatic asylum model for suppressing Howell was implied in the Crown Solicitor's statement. The man is a stupid ranter who puts forward an imaginary being or person who he calls Rastafari and who he describes as Christ, as well as King of Ethiopia. He was literally saying Haile Selassie, and Rastafaris literally say this as well, that Haile Selassie is Christ, a reincarnation, right? Reincarnation, and King of Ethiopians. I think we can leave Howell unadvertised so far as the annexed statements are concerned. The Attorney General was on the same page. I should treat those statements as his ravens and let them go unnoticed. The preferred method of dealing with Howell in the meantime was to spy on him, or to keep a strict eye on him, as directed by the Inspector General of Police to the island's constabulary in a memo. At a meeting at Port Moran, St. Thomas, on 13 September 1933, the police from the area, whom Howell had invited to attend, reported that his meeting was opened with the singing of hymns. He amused himself by taunting the clergymen of different denominations and told people not to go to church because the ministers were liars. You hear what's going on here? The police also reported that Howell talked about slavery and how the white man, again, here you go with the white man I just showed you. You mean Bob Marley's dad? Is that who you're talking about? Stole Africa from Africans. And that black people should think that Africa is their home, not Jamaica. You see this? This is what Rastafari was based on. And this is what Howell believed in and stood for, the founder of Rastafarianism. He was just like Garvey. Let's go back to Africa. Jamaica ain't your home. Look, he said it out of his mouth, from the horse's mouth. On 8 October 1933, Howell made another speech at a public meeting in Port Moran, where it was noted that he chiefly in his speeches abuses the parsons by calling them thieves and robbers, and that they should be driven out of the churches and the churches locked up. He also abuses the white men, calling them rascals and scoundrels, and that they are robbing the people and keeping them down. But their eyes are now open to everything, and that they can live independently without white men. Without white men, living without white men. This is what I was saying earlier. He really believed in that. So if he saw white people in the Rastafari community, he wouldn't be down with that. He's trying to live without white men. Literally. He urges to support his movement for the Negro King Rastafari. Is doing great things for them, and they will be taken to Africa next year, August, by ships provided for the purpose. By ships provided by who? Marcus Garvey, right? Remember Marcus Garvey? There was a whole connection here with him and Garvey. But guess what? Those ships never did that. They were used for profit making for Garvey's ship, the Black Star Line Company, which was about trade and commerce, not transportation to Africa. On December 10, 1933, Leonard Howell and Robert Hines addressed a public gathering of some 300 at Seaforth, St. Thomas. 1 month later, Howell and Hines were arrested and charged for sedition because of speeches they had made at that meeting. Rasta had now entered the first stage of the suppression of his leaders by the state. It had begun with Robert Hines and 3 others who were arrested for sedition on 13 November 1933 while they were having a public meeting in a cane field in Stokes Hall. On 16 December 1933, 6 days after the 10 December meeting, which eventually led to the arrest of Leonard Howell, Hines was again arrested for disorderly conduct at a public meeting in Trinityville. Joseph Hibbert, another pioneer and leader of the Rastafarian Movement, who was present at that meeting along with others, freed Hines from the police. However, John Ross, a vigilante plantocrat who had mobilized to his cause the Reverend M.C. Surgeon, a Methodist minister of Moran Bay, and Seaforth, Ronald Robinson, Justice of the Peace from Port Moran, and Thomas Warfinger of the Port Moran branch of the Jamaica Producers Association, joined forces with the police and rearrested Hines, along with Hibbert and 6 of their supporters. At Howell's trial for sedition at the Moran Bay Courthouse on 13th March 1934, the Daily Gleaner noted that the small courtroom was packed with anxious spectators when Leonard Howell was called up to answer charges of sedition preferred against him. He pleaded not guilty to an indictment charging him with uttering on the 10th of December last year in the presence of H.M.'s liege subjects of seditious speech, in which he abused the sovereign, the Queen Victoria, the governor of Jamaica, and both the governments of Great Britain and this island, thereby intending to excite hatred and contempt for His Majesty the King and of those responsible for the government of this island, and to create disaffection among the subjects of His Majesty and this island, and to disturb the public peace and tranquility of this island. All right. So, in their eyes, that's what they saw. But they were using that against him because they really didn't like what he was doing. And I'm going to be honest, a lot of people knew what he was up to, especially when this whole Pan-African movement, they knew that wasn't the real heritage. But also, of course, because it did point out oppression. And a lot of these oppressors wanted to stay in their positions of power where they can keep oppressing people and making themselves rich. They didn't really care what people believed in. There were already many different religious sects in these islands. The Daily Gleaner reported that Howell, an athletic figure in black with a beard not dissimilar to that worn by the king of Abyssinia, whose photograph and name figured largely in the evidence, was undefended by counsel. Howell defended himself. The newspaper report further noted that Howell wore a rosette of yellow, green, and black similar to that worn by a large number of men and women who accompanied him to court. Howell, according to the Daily Gleaner, took with him into the dock sheaves of documents and a few books of unusual proportions. Howell's defense Haile Selassie as God in the colonial court. Leonard Howell made history in the Moran Bay Courthouse, the historical and symbolic site of elite power and the battle site of the Moran Bay Rebellion of 1865, by becoming the first to declare and defend in the court of British colonialism that Rastafari was the Messiah returned to earth. He was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment for sedition by the Chief Justice of Jamaica, Robert William Lyle Grant. The Daily Gleaner of 17 March 1934 announced the news thus denounced as a fraud by the Chief Justice Leonard Howell, self-made disciple of Rastafari, self-made disciple, King of Abyssinia, an exponent of the doctrine that Rastafari is the Messiah returned to earth, was given a 2-year term of imprisonment yesterday in the St. Thomas Circuit Court at Moran Bay. Between 18 April and 16 December 1933, an average of 1 Rastafari meeting was held per month, mostly in the parish of St. Thomas. Most of them were addressed by Leonard Howell. But this stupid ranter who puts forward an imaginary being or person whom he calls Rastafari, the Christ, as the crown solicitor, contemptuously termed Howell and his thoughts, was meeting with much success in St. Thomas. The idea of Rastafari as anti-colonial alternative, that's why it was so popular, because everybody who was being oppressed and poor kind of related to it. The idea of Rastafari again as an anti-colonial alternative became popular in that parish and frightened the ruling local elites to their core. Howell for them was inciting the black masses to rebel in a parish which had been the location of the Moran Bay uprising 68 years before. The Moran Bay Rebellion became an enduring specter in the imagination of the elite classes, especially those in St. Thomas. From the beginning, persons such as John Ross insisted that Howell should be stopped and that those who were susceptible to the terrible ideas of Rastafari should be quarantined. It was the activism of the elite classes and their allies that helped the authorities to move from their policy to leave Howell unadvertised, to deny him any means of rebellion in the advertisement of a prosecution, to charging him for sedition and sending him to prison. Indeed, the Chief Justice himself, Lyle Grant, left his jurisdiction in Kingston and traveled to Moran Bay to prosecute the case against Howell and Hines to ensure that they were in prison. Lyle Grant's presence as prosecutor in the case was an indication of the serious political importance that the colonial authorities attached to the threat of Rastafari and their determination to kill it in its infancy. But the die was already cast. While in prison, Leonard Howell put down his thoughts about the existential dimension and role of Haile Selassie in Rastas' first tract, The Promised Key. With respect to the news of the coronation of Rastafari, Howell interpreted to mean that the glory that was Solomon greater still reigns in Ethiopia. We can see all the kings of the earth surrendering their crowns to His Majesty Rastafari, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Earth's rightful ruler to reign forever and ever. This is one of the men pushing this whole idea. All right, so I just want to read a little bit of, their version of what happened to Howell. Okay, so again, we're still going to read a little bit more. It says here, African diasporic artistic methods of creating Rastafari. Creating. What conditions and permissive contexts could have conspired to produce the gestational materials and creative process that would become ontological flesh and constituting an anti-colonial Pan-Africanist movement? Anti-colonial, they joined those two together. So of course people related. Centered on the deification of Rastafari, but you had to make him God as Earth's rightful ruler. That's the question. So what conditions created this? The understanding of this creative process and of the ethos, which in the space of 1 year overthrew the epistemic, ontological, psychological culture of a critical core of black peasant laborers, black peasants, the poor people, the people who were being oppressed. They related to it because of that. It's key in making sense of this rare response to the coronation of Rastafari. The ontological construction of such a movement organized around the deification of Rastafari and the inversion of European imperial power is captured in an insightful essay by Robert Hill. This essay, Leonard Howell and Millenarian Visions in Early Rastafari, was published in Jamaica Journal in February 1983. This truly cornerstone narrative of the cosmological roots of Rastafari was republished in 2001 as a monograph called Dread History, Leonard P. Howell and Millenarian Visions in the Early Rastafarian Religion. The present chapter seeks to extend Hill's article with a conceptual and methodological mode of probing, analyzing, and constructing meanings rooted in the cultural, aesthetic, and creative agential traditions of the African diaspora. All right, so they're going to rewrite it a little bit different with the whole African hijack. We're going to get this from the Rastas themselves, their scholars. It says here, Valentine and Rogers, proto-Rastas, and their Ethiopianist text. So they were Rastas before they even knew they were Rastas, they're saying. So these people wrote something in the 1920s, which to the whole, so-called black movement at those times, or back to Africa movements, Pan-African movement, was a big thing. It says here, two prophetic texts of note, the Royal Parchment Scrolls of Black Supremacy from 1926 by the Reverend Fitz Valentine Petersburg, and the Holy Piby by the Anglican Robert Athley Rogers, preceded the coronation of Rastafari by some 4 to 6 years. Preceded, it was before. These two publications, brimming with psalmist forecasts of the certainty of African resurrection, became textual compasses and canonical signatures of the birthing of Rastafari and the articulation of the movement in its infancy. All right, very important literature that influenced the Rastafari movement, had a lot of influence. In case you're not familiar with these books, we're going to get a little brief history on them. All right, so real quick, we got one of the books here. It says the Royal Parchment Scroll of Black Supremacy. Again, Black Supremacy, so-called Black Power, Back to Africa, by Fitz Valentine Petersburg, 1926. This here in the introduction, my dear inhabitants of this world, we are the foundation stones of the resurrection of the kingdom of Ethiopia. Resurrection, kingdom of Ethiopia. Our prayers and labors for your resurrection is past finding out. No libraries in this world is able to contain the work of our hands for you. For we work day and night for your deliverance. And for this generation of the 20th century, you have no knowledge how worlds are built and upon what triggers kingdoms are set. In my encyclopedia, I will explain to you all how worlds are being built and what triggers kingdoms are set on. I will also explain to you the capacities of generations. Speaking for the universe and the womanhood of man, I, the Ethiopian woman, Ethiopian, so that's like the main thing, is the crown woman of the world. This Ethiopia's preface. The preface of this rule book is the finger post in the kingdom of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the succeeding kingdom of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Anglo-Saxons? So I thought it was against Europeans. Anglo-Saxon, who sons of Isaac? Our philosopher is the Anglo-Saxon philosopher's successor, a wide-awake universal mastermind. A man of greater learning is not found on the face of the globe. A swifter thinker is God Almighty, a better Christian soul than King Alpha and Omega. Women must be proud of good men when they are right on the job. Men must be proud of us women when we can deliver able sons and daughters to the four poles of the globe. So these are some of the contents, as you guys can see here: Ethiopia, Western philosophy, the royal move, the healing flow of creation, royal banquet, the book's compound lift cover, chapter 6, Obia, all right, the perfect baptism underwater, the holy ceremony of the mortals, his and her majesty King Alpha and Omega, marriage diploma, the Egyptian copyright department, speaking in diverse tongues, speaking in tongues, my rainbow circle throne, rainbow, Ethiopia's triumphant proclamation, the law of resurrection, world's buildings, some more topics here. Black supremacy's patent officer says Eve, the mother of evil. Black supremacy's infant diploma, and even more topics here. All right, and these are the topics. Just wanted you guys to know. Going back to the other book, Leonard Percival Howell and the Genesis of Rastafari, they also said they got influenced by the Holy Pibby, huh? It says here in Wikipedia, the Royal Parchment Scroll of Black Supremacy is a text from Jamaica written during the 1920s by a proto-Rastafari preacher, Fitz Valentine Petersburg. The Royal Parchment Scroll is today recognized as one of the root documents of Rastafari thought, along with the Holy Pibby and Leonard P. Howell's The Promise Key, which itself made considerable use of content from Petersburg's work. Real quick, in the book Becoming Rasta, Origins of Rastafari, Identity in Jamaica by Charles Price, says here the Holy Pibby, the Royal Parchment Scroll of Black Supremacy, and the Promise Key, three important Ethiopianist oriented texts, all right, influenced the early Rastafari. Robert F. Lee Rogers, an Anglican settled in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, founded the Afro-African Constructive Gafflians, aka the Hamadic Church. It was there that he wrote the Holy Pibby in 1924, which preached the doctrine of the divinity of Ethiopia. The development of a literature that spoke to Black experiences in terms of Ethiopianism exposed white suppression and distortion of Black history and culture. And they say the Bible, which the Bantu now have, is the wrong book. Right? They don't go down with the Bible. There exists, they say, another Bible hidden away from the Bantu by the whites, a book containing the real truth, whilst the old Bible, as the Bible was called in such circles, was written only to cheat the Black man. One source of this propaganda seems to be the Afro-African Constructive Church of Negro origin. They know and possess another Bible, the right Ethiopian Bible called the Holy Pibby. According to them, the old Bible was given to the children of the house of Israel, whereas the Holy Pibby has been given to children of the house of Ethiopia, to Hamites. Huh? Do you see how they made a distinction? It's not the same as the one that was given to the children of Israel. Now you tell me what that means. I didn't say it, they said it themselves. It is no coincidence that the King of Kings, the Lion of Judah and Zion, constructed in terms of blackness, existed in the United States, Bantu, South Africa, and Jamaica. The contributions of Black-based in America were instrumental. For example, Rogers, who revered Garvey, he was a Garveyite back to Africa, founded a branch of his Ethiopianist-inspired church, the Afro-African Constructive Church in Kimberley, South Africa. Around 1924 to 25, Rogers met two Jamaicans in Cologne, Panama, Charlie Goodrich and Mother Grace Garrison, who resettled in Jamaica and formed a branch of the Afro-African Church there. The church, however, was not well received by Jamaican Garveyites, and they forced it to move from Kingston. The Holy Pibby turned up in St. Thomas, where key founding Rastafari evangelist Leonard Howell will later preach his vision of Rastafari. Hill believes that Howell found the Holy Pibby in Port Morant. Reverend Fitz Petersburg, the Royal Parchment Scroll, refers repeatedly to King Alpha and Queen Omega and emphasizes the resurrection of Ethiopia. Resurrection. It is likely that Reverend Petersburg, an African-American preacher, visited Jamaica. Leonard Howell himself authored The Promise Key, a document that was circulated in the meetings of the early Rastafari. Hill suggests that Howell plagiarized, all right? Howell what? plagiarized the royal parchment scroll, which from an academic perspective might be true. From an academic perspective, if you actually compare them and do the history, he probably did, most likely did, just like Drew Ali literally copied the Aquarian writings of Jesus into his Circle 7 Quran. However, the contemporary term open source literature perhaps better describes the attitude of Howell and his followers toward ideas. All right, just want to read that real quick since we were talking about those two things. Now, regarding the Holy Pibby, also known as the Black Man's Bible, is a text written by an Anglican Robert Affley Rogers for the use of Afrocentric religion in the West Indies, founded by Rogers in the 1920s, known as the Afro-Anglican Constructive Catholic. The theology outlined in this work saw Ethiopians, in the classical sense of all Africans, as the chosen people of God. The church preached self-reliance and self-determination for Africans, using the Pibby as its guiding document. So real quick, this is a copy of the Holy Pibby. Just want to read sign here by Robert Affley Rogers again. And these are the contents. As you guys can see, first book of Affley called Atli, the creation, dead became alive. The second book, Affley called Aggregation, having grieved, presentation of the law, God's holy law to the children of Ethiopia. It says here, chapter 7, Marcus Garvey. All right, Marcus Garvey, Heaven and Hell, the Guiding Light. It says the Holy Pibby is made up of 4 books. The first, entitled the First Book of Affley, called Atli, was only 2 chapters. The second book of Affley, called Aggregation, is the largest, with 15 chapters, the 7th of which identifies Marcus Garvey as one of the 3 apostles of God. You see that? They said he was an apostle, the guy who got funded by white supremacists and was trying to make you go to Africa. The third book of Affley, named The Facts of the Apostles, presents 2 prominent members of the UNIA-ACL, Robert Lincoln Poston and Henrietta Vinton Davis, as the other apostles in the Holy Trinity. Okay, what is the UNIA? The Universal Negro Improvement Association. Do you guys hear the connections here? All these people with the same background and beliefs, creating all these movements. Many of the Garveyites were in the Moorish Science, many of the Garveyites in the Pan-African movement. Now we see many Garveyites involved or influenced the Rastafari movement. How convenient, all these trying to make you go back to Africa. The title of the last book is the 4th book of Affley, called Precaution. That book is followed by a series of catechism-style questions and answers wherein Garvey, Davis, and Poston are proclaimed to be the saviors of the downtrodden children of Ethiopia, saviors. Together with the Royal Parchment Scroll of Black Supremacy by Fitz Ballantyne, Petersburg, and Leonard P. Howell, the Promise Key, the Holy Pibby today is recognized as a root document of Rastafari thought. All right, we're just getting started in the presentation. This is one of the influences already of the Rastafari thought. You guys saw what it was about. While not strictly speaking a Rastafari text, it was certainly a primary source of influence to many in the Rastafari movement, who see Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia as the second coming of Christ. Some Rastafari see Emperor Haile Selassie I as Christ and his kingly character as written in the book of Revelation, chapter 5, and regard Marcus Mosiah Garvey as a prophet. Marcus is a prophet, really? Okay. We're going to go back to the book we were reading earlier. So they're going to interview here Leonard Howell a little bit and tell you about his background. It says, according to Robert Hill, Leonard Howell was born 16th of June 1898 in the village of May Crawley near Crooked River in the Bullhead Mountain District of Upper Clarendon. He was the oldest of 10 children. His father, Charles Theophilus Howell, was an independent peasant cultivator and a tailor, and his mother, Clementina Bennett, was an agricultural laborer. All right, I'm going to do another video, guys, and I have his genealogy actually done. I got this guy's family tree. That's going to be one of my episodes, Genealogical Stories. Howell became a seaman and was part of a Jamaican contingent sent to Colon, Panama during the First World War. He traveled back and forth between New York and Panama a few times before settling in the former in 1918. He remained there for several years, becoming a member of Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, all right? This is the guy who founded Rastafari. He was part of Garvey's movement, Universal Negro Improvement Association. And noting Garvey's organizational techniques, he then returned to Jamaica in 1932, whereupon he started preaching the divinity of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I, all right, right after, right after he became a Garveyite. That's when he started doing that. Significantly, soon after Howell started preaching that Haile Selassie I was the manifestation of God in the flesh upon his return to Jamaica, he joined forces with the notable Bedwardite and Garveyite Robert Hines. Not only did Hines have the distinction of being a staunch lieutenant of Howell during the early years of Rastafari in the early 1930s, when the parish of St. Thomas became the crucible for the movement, but he also represented the important link between the rich revivalist tradition in Jamaica and the emergent Rastafari movement. All right, they connected the two. This Bedwardite, that's him right here in this picture, prior to his espousal of divinity of Haile Selassie I, the first, Hines had been a devout disciple of Alexander Bedward, the legendary revivalist leader from Augusttown who effectively led the Native Baptist Church from 1895 to 1921, right? Revivalist people, all church people, at which time he was incarcerated in the Bellevue Lunatic Asylum. In addition to Hines, many other among Howell's first followers were old-time Bedwardites. The possibility of religious convergence clearly existed in the parish of St. Thomas, and thus the early Rastafari preachers, Howell and Hines specifically, were able to find ready converts there. All right, literally a religious movement. In fact, St. Thomas had proven to be a good recruiting ground for Rastafari adherents, as this was not only a parish where many revivalists were based, but also one in which there were numerous Kurimeo practitioners. Listen to this, many of whom were descendants of 19th century Central African immigrants to Jamaica. That's not slaves, literally telling you people who migrated in the 1800s, okay? This is a big one right here. They're not from slaves from the 1500s, 1600s. It's literally telling you they were descendants of 19th century, 1800s, Central African immigrants. Immigrants, they came on their own on ships. Immigrants, probably through indentured servitude or something like that. Whatever way, they came as immigrants to Jamaica, not as slaves. This was later on. And they, yeah, look, they influenced it as well. And that's from Dread History, all right? Interested to see what sources he has for these Central African immigrants. But either way, he's letting you know immigrants in the 1800s, not from the slave trade. Interestingly, in conversation in 2012 with one of this volume's editors and contributors, Clinton Houghton, I was told that a Rastafari elder by the name of Brother Man said that when he came to Kingston from St. Elizabeth in 1940, he was already Rastafari, and that this was because the Revivalist Church in Western Jamaica, which he had been part of, had declared Haile Selassie I as God Almighty soon after his coronation in 1930. See, they were already practicing that. They were literally worshiping him. This is extremely valuable ethnography as it alludes to the possibility of additional flashpoints for the emergence of Rastafari in Jamaica other than the preaching by Howell, Hines, Hibbert, and Dunkley. Additionally, Dr. Houghton told me that he had learned from other respondents who had been formerly part of the revivalist tradition in St. Thomas that the Kukumina Church in St. Thomas had declared Haile Selassie I as Nasambi, a supreme deity in Congo cosmology. The fact that this Congo cosmology was most strongly expressed by the Kumino practitioners of St. Thomas, all right, who were immigrants from the 1800s, is proof that a significant convergence of religious belief systems had in fact taken place in that parish. So now we're going to talk about Joseph Hibbert, all right, the man right here in this drawing, painting. It says Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert was another of the early preachers of the divinity of Haile Selassie I. He was born in Jamaica, 1894, but traveled to Costa Rica. All right, he was here in Costa Rica with his adoptive father in 1911. In 1924, Hibbert joined the ancient mystic order of Ethiopia, a Masonic society. All right, a Masonic, he was a Mason. Again, Hibbert joined the ancient mystic order of Ethiopia, a Masonic society very similar to the one Drew Ali had joined in Egypt, based in Panama. which did not become formally incorporated until 1928. Hibbert became a master mason of this order. Again, Hibbert became a master mason of this order before he returned to Jamaica in 1931, which was notably months before Leonard Howell's return. In fact, Rasiku Sankara Tafari, in the preface to the 2001 republication of Robert Hill's Dread History article, argues that Hibbert was already teaching the divinity of Haile Selassie I in Jamaica before the return of Howell to the island in 1932. All right, so these two were actually battling the claim of who said Selassie was God first. It was between Hibbert and Howell. Leonard Barrett also alludes to the distinct likelihood that Hibbert started to preach that Haile Selassie I was divine at Benoa in the district of St. Andrew before Howell returned to Jamaica. Therefore, it could quite easily be argued, controversial as it may be, that Hibbert was the first Rastafari preacher and thus the first Rasta, not Howell. Whether or not one chooses to entertain this postulation, what cannot be refuted is that Howell was a much more effective propagandist than was Hibbert, and was thus able to garner a much larger following. Remember, we're reading this from Rastafari scholars themselves, all right? That's why I wanted to read this first. According to Barry Chavanis, Hibbert was something of a mystic, that is, a leader who built his organization along the lines of occultism, right? Occultist, a mystic. Just like Drew Ali. He professed that there were hidden secrets in the books of the Maccabees, as well as in the publications of Lauren William de Lawrence on occult and spiritual topics. Many of Hibbert's congregants were awed by his reputed powers and were desirous of learning his magical secrets. According to Chavanis, what led to the decline of Hibbert's organization was a combination of two things. First, he was unwilling to impart his innermost secrets to his initiates. Second, he did not tolerate anyone or anything that challenged his leadership. Under conclusions, I wanted to read here, it says, when we ask the question of who should be dubbed the first Rasta, there are several candidates. We have the Harveys, who founded the Israelite sect in Jamaica in the early 1930s. Additionally, we have the possibility that some of the revivalist churches in Jamaica may have declared Haile Selassie I as God or divine shortly after his 1930 coronation. And then we have the case of Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert. Hibbert is the strongest candidate, I feel, by the mere fact that after being so deeply immersed in the ancient mystic order of Ethiopia while in Costa Rica and becoming a master mason, as well as being highly familiar with the Ethiopic version of the Bible, it is highly likely that he would have believed Haile Selassie I to be divine in an independent fashion shortly after the grand coronation, as opposed to a couple of years or so after the event. All right, a master mason, Hibbert. All right, we're going to read from this book right now. It's called The First Rasta, Leonard Howell and the Rise of Rastafarianism by Helene Lee. Let's hear in Chapter 1, The Footsteps of a Spirit. A rusty placard at a bend in the road reads, De La Vega Heights, lots for sale. It points towards a faded trail leading up into the hills. This is the entrance to Pinnacle, the taxi driver says. I give him $20 and walk toward the entrance. Behind me, the Lada taxi lingers, while the passengers' eyes follow me in silence. Not long before, as we were passing a house in the valley, the driver had knowingly commented, two pygmy children from Pinnacle bury in this corner, and now them build a house upon the grave. The lady squeezing next to me scolds. It full of duppy spirits, this gully. The road I'm walking on looks abandoned. The tar is gray and eaten up by plants at the edges. But it seems like it was built to last. Who built it, and where does it lead? There is nothing in sight for miles. I tread on. The road winds into a maze of hills, right, left, right again, and after a while I lose my sense of direction. Under the tropic sun, everything is silent. Dried creepers hang limp from the trees. Is this really Pinnacle, the promised land of the Rastafarians? Pinnacle. Every book about the Rasta movement mentions Pinnacle, but no one seems to know where it is, or what happened there. Was the most fascinating 20th century religion born here, in this brilliant chaos of green jungle and rugged limestone? Did the planet-wide phenomenon of red green, and gold culture, reggae, dreadlocks, and an international champion of human rights spring from this very spot. And here's a picture of the remains of Pinnacle's great house, it says here, as you guys can see. When Pinnacle, the first Rastafarian community, was burned to the ground in 1958, an estimated 2,000 of its residents took refuge in Kingston. Ironically, the Jamaican police had succeeded only in spreading the Rasta menace they were trying to suppress. From then on, the preachers and disciples of this strange cult based their headquarters in the downtown ghettos of the capital, where they were feared and despised by the Jamaican establishment. The Rastas' poverty, their boldness of speech, and their wild looks were a contemptuous challenge to the colonial order. Jamaican educators and preachers realized that the Rastafarians could become a real threat to established religion in Jamaica. The rich and especially the middle class saw them as a rebel army crawling nearer to their uptown lawns. After 18 years of peaceful relations within the boundaries of the Pinnacle community, thousands of Rastas had been thrown into Western Kingston's hopeless maze of decrepit panties. The terrible conditions in Trenchtown and the other slums left them in a desperate struggle to survive. All right, so a little history of what happened to the people in Pinnacle. They ended up in the ghettos. A little bit about Leonard Percival Howell again. It says, according to his birth certificate, Leonard Percival Howell was born June 16, 1898, 18 months before the turn of the century, coming of age at a crossroads in world history, between the old world and the new, between black and white, Marx and the Bible. Howell lit a spiritual spark whose explosion sent shockwaves even to the remotest villages on the planet. To millions of youth across the earth, Jamaica is the land of Bob Marley and the Rastafarians. But the reality of the island is far removed from the cliche. In Jamaica, Rastafarians still suffer for religious beliefs that society deems delusional. Police harassment continues to this day since the Rasta sacrament of ganja or marijuana remains illegal. Female bank clerks are fired for growing locks. Rasta parents still have to go to court to demand their children be enrolled into decent schools. Even history seems to conspire against them. No one has done any serious research on Leonard Howell, the first Rasta. In vain, I looked up his name in the catalogs of university libraries. Almost every single study refers to the university report and accepts its vague approximations. After jailing Howell, wrecking his properties, stealing his money, arresting his disciples, and violating his rights in every possible manner, the establishment now strives to erase him from memory. His rich library was seized by the army and dispersed. His legal archives were burned. Only 3 pictures of him have been rescued. No recording of his voice, no film footage remain. And it says here, so who was the first Rasta? Besides my burning curiosity, my only guide during my quest to learn more about this shadow figure was an article published in the Jamaica Journal of February 1983 entitled Leonard Howell and Millenarian Visions in Early Rastafari by Professor Robert Hill of the University of California. I always carried a battered copy of this article at the bottom of my bag. Hill, a leading authority on Marcus Garvey, does not share the Jamaican disdain for the first Rasta. His article is a bubbling account of the ideas crisscrossing the politically and culturally tumultuous Caribbean of the 1930s. For me, it was a map to a fascinating treasure hunt. But where to start? Look to a country place called Redlands, Crook River, Hill writes, for this is where Howell was born. Continuing a little further ahead, it says, so Leonard went to the States, leaving behind his ancestral Jamaican paradise, where a child can survive on wild fruits and snare birds, barefoot in complete freedom. Daphne told us the story of his departure like one of those family legends that people tell 100 times, but no one can actually confirm. Chronologically challenged, it engenders more questions than it answers. How old was Leonard when he was hunting birds? Was he up there by chance, or did he already know that from up high he could learn some of the secrets of the world? In the 1940s, he told a journalist that he started his father's work at age 6. What had happened to turn a 6-year-old into a mystic? Maybe this tragedy of love and death? And what did he learn about the means that the system uses to pressure a stubborn child? Whatever the case may be, Leonard Howell was able to keep his secret. And he grew to understand that when one knows the secrets of society, one has a powerful tool to use against it. All right? Talking in these secret codes right here. Subliminal. Continue, it says here, when Howell left Jamaica, the Panama scene was in full bloom. The canal was still being dug. The Jamaican community was big and resourceful as he was. Howell had no problem finding his way there. He made several visits to Panama, working there at different times. In 1924, when he decided to settle permanently in the United States, he declared to the immigration authorities that he came from Colon and had left his Jamaican wife, Myra, there. Panama played an important role in the developing African American consciousness. It provided a haven for the exchange of information and ideas, and from there, people boarded steamers headed for exotic destinations. Howell was not the only one of the early Rastas to visit Panama. Joseph Myers, whose name often appears in the petitions of the Jamaican Back to Africa movement, all right, Joseph Myers, lived in Panama. According to the university report, Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert, born in 1894, emigrated to Bocas del Toro in 1911, that's in Panama near Costa Rica. After staying several years in Costa Rica, he went to live in Cologne, where he was ordained master of a Masonic society called an Ancient Mystic Order of Ethiopia. All right, a mystic order, Master Mason. In 1931, 1 year before Howell's return, Hibbert went back to Jamaica, where he was to become Howell's lieutenant. All right, these are the founders of the Rastafari movement. All right, we got a Master Mason, Archibald Dunkley, who was credited with researching the Bible for opposite quotations about the King of Kings, also visited Panama while he was working for the Atlantic Fruit Company. He went back to Jamaica around the same time, December 1930. Three forerunners of the movement, Atligi Rogers, Grace Jenkins, and Valentine Petersburg, appeared to have met in Panama in 1924, right? We already got these people before, you see? They all had a common background. But the most visible of all Jamaican migrants to Panama was no doubt Marcus Garvey. Even Garvey there, all these people Garveyites too. Continuing, it says here, there's no doubt that Leonard Howell was deeply influenced by Marcus Garvey, and that during his time at sea he'd become familiar with Marx's doctrine. He had debated with the famous tabaqueros, Cuban cigar workers who paid people to read to them newspapers, African history, novels, political essays while they worked. They closely followed new trends in international opinion and were often taught to harbor seditious ideas. Unless the job was definitely marked colored on the board outside, there was no use applying, discovered Langston Hughes. When confronted with the problem, and only one job in 1,000 would be marked as such, the only jobs available were those of porter, busboy, or janitor, but it is hard to see the proud Leonard Howell cleaning floors or handling suitcases. His daughter, Catherine, protests when people suggest that her father may have worked such jobs or worked as a cook on ships. He could not even boil water. However, in 1924, he wrote down porter as his occupation on his application for U.S. citizenship. He also worked in Hoboken, New Jersey, and then in Astoria, Queens, where he was a small construction contractor with his own team of workers. All right. In 1929, Howell was back in Harlem. A former Garveyite declared to Hill that Howell opened a tea room on 136th Street, a famous haven for preachers and radicals and a stronghold of the UNIA. But the Great Association did not fancy what he was doing there and declared against Howell in New York. What exactly was he doing that they disapproved of? Could the tea room have been one of the 500 ganja dens that one particular police report of the day mentions? I.T. Howell was indulgent, the Garveyite said, in a number of nefarious practices. He was even accused of being an Obeahman. All right, he was an Obeahman. Obia is a black magic, the Jamaican counterpart of voodoo. Leonard Howell was not a sorcerer. His magic potions were probably what Rastas of today would call roots, vegetable tonics of rich nutritional value. Howell knew Obia, but he never indulged in its practice. One of his followers remembers that only one time did he witness a sacrifice performed by Howell. He reportedly threw a living lamb into a bonfire, but close enough to the edge to allow the lamb to escape, probably with the intent to create a new parable, that the lamb was ultimately to escape the fire and tribulation. But his followers misunderstood his gesture, and they caught the animal and threw it back in. Howell ran to the rescue of the lamb, but it was too late. This explicit rejection of Obia is a characteristic of the early Rasta movement, and it ought to be considered by modern sects who sometimes endorse superstitious practices in the name of Rastafari. Ballantyne's royal parchment scroll of black supremacy, here it goes again, has a powerful declaration on this issue, later plagiarized by Howell and his Promise Key. All right, plagiarized. He just copied it and wrote another book and called it Promise Key. Howell was not an opium, but he could have been a healer. Bombyards are traditional hospitals where sick and deranged people are brought to be healed by mystic men. Maybe he tried to adapt the concept of the bombyard to Harlem's cityscape. What else could he dispense in his tea room on 136th Street beside comfort to the disillusioned and lost? This here all the way in chapter 5, Athlete Rogers, forerunner of the Rasta movement. 1932, the year of Leonard Howell's return to Jamaica, and his first circulation of Haile Selassie's portrait is technically the start of the Rasta movement, but it would be unjust to assign all the credit to Howell alone. He was not the only ex-Garveyite, ex-Garveyite to tackle the one question left unanswered by the UNIA, the question of religion. In his endorsement of modern practical thinking, Garvey had neglected the religious needs of millions of his followers. In 1921, he realized that he had to take a stand on the subject, and he allowed George Alexander Maguire, the UNIA chaplain, to create a new and independent Christian denomination, the African Orthodox Church. But this new denomination failed to satisfy the emotional and cultural needs of newly empowered African Americans, many of whom no longer wanted to worship a version of Messianic Christ, who was tortured to death on a cross amid thieves. What was needed was a new Messiah, preferably black, and a king in this world. If Garvey wanted to succeed, blacks had to be able to identify with kings and princes, not with crucified slaves. A new Messiah was what millions of Garvey's followers sought in their leader, but he declined this grandiose opportunity. In New Jersey, another inspired black man heard the call to preach a new black Messiah. His name was Athlete Rogers, and he could well be the missing link between Garveyism and Rastafari. Back in 1924, the year Howell settled in New York, a flyer was posted on the streets of Newark, New Jersey. Great world leader to speak. Shepherd, Athlete Rogers, make the black race an economical power to save it from suffering. Best service to God, says the Catholic religion. The picture shows a young man standing raised arms open wide in a robe lined with three colors. He is dark like Howell, with strong regular features. Could Athlete be one of the many avatars of the first Rasta? Those well-articulated brows, the strong jaw, the mustache split in the middle look like Leonard Howell. I showed the picture to one of Howell's baby mothers in Jamaica. This is Mr. Howell, she exclaims, but the old lady also has poor eyesight. Ross Miguel Lorne, a Kingston lawyer, writer, and champion of Rasta culture, insists that Athlete Rogers and Howell are two different people, despite the physical resemblance, similarities in their methods, and the fact that they both claim addresses in Africa. Howell fancied himself in Accra, Ghana, while writing the Promise Key in jail in Jamaica. All right. So people thought he told people he wrote that book in Ghana, the one he plagiarized. And he also said he was, living in Ghana. He was born in Africa and all that. And he lied about all that too to people. So both him and this other Athlete Rogers, and this is pretty interesting because they're saying it actually might be him. Rogers referred to a house of Gaffley, 252 Nahum Bain Street, Kimberley, South Africa, on a document printed in Woodbridge, New Jersey. Did the two meet in the States? Howell spent time in Hoboken, not far from Newark. He definitely read the Black Bible or Holy Pibby, the founding document of Athlete's religion, because he plagiarized some parts for his own Promise Key. Maybe he didn't plagiarize because it's him. The Holy Pibby is a slim tract of the kind missionary sects issued to their adherents. It is strongly influenced by Garvey, whom Athlete declares an apostle of the Lord God for the redemption of Ethiopia, all right? And he was, again, in this Bible, he was an apostle, Marcus Garvey. Garvey and Athlete, God Athlete, are two angels, the double vision of the Godly religion, combining the mystical and the ecumenical. One depends on the other. The UNIA project of bringing social redemption to the black race is not possible unless each individual redeems himself first from mental slavery. This is the crux of the Rasta ideal. What is the right wing of the House of Athlete, the Afro-African Constructive Church. What is the left wing of the House of Lee? The Anglican Green Pasture. Among possible allies was the African group, or what remained of it. Among them he met another strange character, Ballantyne, whom the Rastas remember as Valentine. Reverend Fitz Ballantyne, Petersburg, had also lived in New York. He returned in 1924, the same year of Af Lee's Comet, Grace Jenkins Garrison. In 1926, 1 year before the young Ethiopian prince Tafari became Ras chief, and 4 years before he was crowned King of Kings under the name of Haile Selassie, Ballantyne issued an esoteric pamphlet, all right, esoteric. This is where Leonard Howell, remember, got his whole Rastafarian movement from influence, right? The royal parchment of black supremacy, which, remember, Howell plagiarized and wrote The Promised Key, filled with references to the King of Kings of Ethiopia, all right? King of Kings of Ethiopia. You see, it wasn't always a Rasta thing. This was already around. They just created a whole different movement in Jamaica with it. Again, an esoteric pamphlet. So remember, all this is going down in the 1920s, same year, Marcus Garvey, right? UNIA, the Moorish Science thing. What a coincidence. Regarding the pamphlet, right, that Royal Parchment of Black Supremacy, the Daily Gleaner, June 6, 1927, dismissed it. The grammar is like the sense, which seems to us to be indistinguishable from nonsense. And the whole concoction is so putrid that we must wonder what class of people could ever take such rubbish seriously. The truth is that the Royal Parchment is indeed hard to read. The text is a long poem, jumping from bold political assumptions. Ethiopia is the succeeding kingdom of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. There you go again, Anglo-Saxon kingdom. To pure surrealist poetry, I am the copyright of this world. The barbed wire eternity is mine. And they're talking about how the author's making himself like a prophet or god, you know. I am going to teach the princess to fly around the poles. They're quoting him. Numerous repetitions suggest that the possibly illiterate Ballantyne could not reread what he dictated. The transcription sometimes sounds awkward. It is even possible that the printers deliberately cut up Ballantyne and turned his poetry into gibberish. But the preacher's language seems designed to trick the establishment. Under the biblical jargon, esoteric wordplay, and arcane Masonic symbolism, Masonic is the influence that Howell used, right? Masonic symbolism, there is clearly a seditious message, and sometimes the language is openly raw. I pulled white supremacy, and modern God Almighty is insulted by astrologers. The root and foundation of world's buildings is by communication. The wisdom of God depends on communication, all right? So these are all quotes from his book, right? The Royal Parchment of Black Supremacy. Nevertheless, from the inchoate, rambling, and erotico-mystical poems, one can extract clear political implications. Unlike Af Lee, who refers to a symbolic Ethiopia, Ballantyne appeals to a very practical racial supremacy. We are the foundation stones of the resurrection of the kingdom of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a succeeding kingdom to the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. We are not business with Anglo-militant nakedness. Black must not marry white, not white-black, race enmity. All right, you see? This is the foundation. They weren't cool with so-called white people. They wouldn't be down with so-called white Rastas today. And white Rastas don't even know the origin of the whole Rastafarian movement. Adam, Abraham, Anglo-Saxon, the leprous teacher. Before I trust a white person, I trust a snake. You see that? Ballantyne also ran a barnyard, a gathering place for spirituality and folk healing, and a precursor of later Rasta yards. We pick you up from out of the midst of the raging misery of the land and hide you from the raging wolves of the land into our barnyard. There Ballantyne cleanses his followers of white bondage and filth. Baptism is a very important subject to black supremacy. All must wash their hands and souls, minds and hearts from Adam, Abraham, Anglo-Saxon, the leprous teacher. Follow me with your cup of troubles to the burying place of sin and shame. All right, this is what they're saying in these books. Slavery is not just history. It is a stain that keeps the black man away from his creator. He has to wash his soul to be reunited with him. Then man can reclaim his divine nature. I and my Creator are one in purpose. I personally am His Majesty King Alpha, the King of Kings. Millions living now will never die. But first and last, every soul for admission must believe in the power of the living God. The King of Kings, the living God, redeeming the black race and saving it from death. Is this not the Rasta concept? Valentine could also have been the first Rasta, except that his era was as yet unaware of Ras King Tafari of Ethiopia. Valentine was linked with the Atlicans. He knew Atli Rogers, good little messenger, who let himself be fooled by one fallen angel called Douglas. Pilot Marcus Garvey, was also fooled by a fallen angel, Lady Astonishment, the Anglo-militant upside-down queen. Valentine also cited other members of the little group, Grace Jenkins and Professor W.D. Davis, who met with him at the world's capital, Kingston, with the little PB, Reverend and Mrs. Charles Goodrich, who were also gone with the message, as well as Reverend W.R. Carter and his sister Addie, who were without a doubt Atlicans. Grace Jenkins, the Comet Garrison, left Panama for Jamaica in 1924. In 1925, while Valentine was writing his book, Grace was struggling with her own small group and trying to build the Hamitic Church in Kingston. All right, again, Hamitic. Continuing the book, The First Rasta, says here in chapter 11, The Hindu Legacy. Kingston, 1935. While Havel was still in jail, the hardened commercial printer published an Ethiopianist religious tract called The Promised Key. On the cover, under two cross keys, a Masonic symbol, all right, a Masonic symbol, is the name of the pamphlet's putative patron, Dr. Namdi Azikiwe, editor of the African Morning Post, Accra, Gold Coast, present-day Ghana. The work is credited to a Gigi Marag. The name Marag is common among Jamaican East Indians. Mr. Ganga Marag, a prominent businessman, had recently been a defendant in a well-publicized civil trial. His name made marijuana smokers laugh. In those days, ganja was often spelled ganga. The promised key comes with little doubt from the small group of Ethiopians in Kingston. Much of the text comes from Valentine. Some verses come from the Holy Pibi, and Annie Harvey probably contributed the description of Selassie's coronation. Gigi Marag is Leonard Howell. Gan Marag, the tough king. All right, that is him, Leonard Howell. He wrote the Promised Key, remember. That was his work. He plagiarized, remember. And he put these Masonic symbols on the cover. And he went by this name. He is the original Gong, published under an alias to avoid persecution. Did he compile his text in jail? Was the Promised Key printed by one of his lieutenants to maintain a textual presence among his followers? Or did Howell publish it when he was released in 1936 and backdated to protect himself? Released from prison, Howell assumed his new name, Gangunguru Mara, Gan for short. He was known by this until the 1960s, all right? He's the original Gan. The choice of an Indian identity is significant. The Indian connection has been the most neglected of all the Rasta influences until it was documented in the 1980s by Laxmi and Ajay Mansingh of the University of the West Indies. All right, guys? This is the part right here. You think the whole dreadlock thing and the whole smoking ganja, you think that was from Africa? That was a Hindu connection. I've been telling you that when I did my Black Asians video. Their historic work on Indian immigration in Jamaica, Home Away from Home, critically and convincingly restores important aspects of Rastafarian culture that later Afrocentric visions devalued or ignored. All right, Afrocentric people, Pan-African gatekeepers, they devalued this history and ignored it. They take us back to May 10th, 1845, when Old Harbor citizens witnessed the arrival of the first shipload of indentured immigrants from India and their subsequent transfer to Halsey Hall, a sugar plantation in Clarendon. All right, you guys know I've showed you the pictures of what these Hindu people look like. And remember, they were bringing so-called Chinos, and they were calling them Hindus since the 1500s. It didn't just start in 1845. Check out my Real Slave Trade Part 3 video You see what I'm talking about? These laborers replaced emancipated African slaves. They replaced what Africans? Who refused to work for their former masters. The Falmouth Post reported that the coolies were not athletic, but active and weary, and as good-tempered and happy as said as were ever seen. The few Negroes who were present at their landing seemed rather pleased, and mingled with them readily. They were transported to allotted plantations by horse buggies and greeted by the Afro-Jamaicans, Dutch to hijack, who often offered food and drink to them. Relations between coolies and Jamaicans never became antagonistic, and the limited number of women among the Indians expedited a quick absorption into the black population, so-called black. What black? There's Indians that are so-called black and black Europeans, so that's very broad. As a child in Clarendon, Howell had contact with this community. It is possible he, like many Jamaicans, copied their habit of smoking marijuana. Ganja is the Hindi Urdu word for cannabis sativa, all right? Ganja. And it is generally accepted that successive waves of Indian immigrants introduced marijuana use to the island, okay? Howell probably drank their sacred bhang, the refreshing ganja elixir. Above all, he was probably most impressed by the power of Hindu culture and by the strength they drew from daily contact with their gods. Okay? This is deep right here. Hope you guys paying attention. At the end of the day's work on the plantation, the workers would retire to the barracks, which was not far from those of the ex-slaves. After attending to personal and family chores, the priest among them would sit down with the children and adults and read the Ramayana and Puranic stories. Maya. Remember about Prince Maya? That was the Nagas, who were anciently so-called Mayas. Later, the musicians would satisfy their urges by singing devotional and folk songs. Initially, these activities were restricted to Indians only, but as friendly neighborhood contact evolved with Afro-Jamaicans Dutch the hijack, the two cultures began to join in each other's rituals. Almost at regular intervals, a few individuals in every Indian community would perform a secret Kali Puja. Selected friends and relatives were invited to an unknown spot where a ram was sacrificed with a single stroke of a machete, amid loud the chanting of mantras invoking the goddess Kali. After certain ceremonies, which involved the smoking of ganja, the congregation would return to the home of the host, chanting and shouting, Jai Kali Mai, drinking of bhang, marijuana, smoking of ganja, hailing the goddess, and dancing and singing preceded the dinner of curried goat and bat. All right, curried goat. All right. Curious Afro Jamaicans would always eavesdrop at a distance in hidden places. Some of them would join the festivities as guests. Okay, this is deep, and a lot of this culture and bloodline is in a lot of Jamaicans. It is likely that Howell, the secretive child, the treetop observer, knew something of the Kali Pujas. As a sailor, he met many Indian fellow workers. He later had children by an Indian woman and was an admirer of Mahatma Gandhi. He shared the Hindu fascination of his contemporaries. Hinduphilia had been a general trend in Black America and the Caribbean for some time. In 1919 to 1920, a Hindu revival under the flag of Kali took British Guiana by storm. In New York, Indian medicine was highly rated by the black population. Occult books like the Great Book of Magical Arts and Hindu Magic and Indian Occultism were in vogue. A black dandy known as Hindu styled along the streets of Harlem in green satin, pantaloons, golden slippers, and a turban. Meanwhile, in Jamaica, Howell absorbed teachings from the Indians. There were many in St. Thomas, and some reportedly came to him for healing. A big man called Lalu became his bodyguard and is said to have been responsible for the Hindi Urdu part of Howell's prayers. But when Howell founded Pinnacle, Lalo did not follow him. Who was he? In 1934, in Seaforth, St. Thomas, one Mrs. Lalo was ridiculed and song to provoke the Rastas, but there were many Lalus, as it was a familiar Indian nickname for light-skinned people. Another coincidence, at the end of the 19th century, an Indian-influenced Guyanese cult, the White-Robed Army, had for leaders one Maharaj and one Lalu. The Mansingh studies have enumerated Howell's innumerable borrowings from the Indians. His name Gangunguru Mara, from Gyan, knowledge, Guna, virtue, Guru, teacher, and Maharaj, king. His prayers' use of Hindi words, his concept of God King, the sacramental use of ganja, meditation, vegetarian cooking, and spices, and even the holy salutation, Jah Rastafari. One can hear the loud chants of Jai Bhagwan, Jai Rama, Jai Krishna, or Jai Kali. Victory to God, Rama, Krishna, and Kali. Alright, means victory. At any private or community Hindu puja or prayer meeting, as Rastafari gained the status of African Lord, Rama, Krishna during the 1940s, phonetic usage of the word Jai was continued, but Rama, Krishna, and Kali were replaced by Rastafari. You hear that? They just replaced it with Rastafari. Searching the Old Testament, the Rastas found the word Jah, which is phonetically similar to the Hindi word Jai. Howell not only borrowed some exotic words and rituals from the Indians to feed the fancies of an illiterate audience, all right, an illiterate audience. His followers were poor, remember, we read that earlier. He also adopted a way of thinking, Indian thought, karma, and rebirth, providing him with a system that resolved the Western dichotomy of heaven and hell, Jesus and Satan, black and white, spirit and flesh. This different approach allowed Howell to recast the Rasta identity in a different mode, one both ancient and proven to work. Prisoners of the old dichotomy tried to turn an oppressive system around to replace white supremacy with black supremacy, what Valentine called the Anglo militant upside down queen. But Howell did not get caught in this reverse trap. In the Indian cosmology, he found a third solution. Amid its innumerable lords and gods, the Hindu reality was cyclical. Nothing was good or bad forever. New causes brought new effects on a turn of a wheel of time. The flowing concepts of Indian thought allowed transformation from one state to another, from slave to king. This helped heal the injuries of slavery's middle passage and reconcile black and white. God and man, Rama and Krishna, were spiritual beings with perfect karma, kings who ruled their kingdoms with wisdom. The rituals, Mansingh says, had always aroused curiosity among black Jamaicans. The answer to every inquiry about Lord Rama or Krishna was that they were God incarnates, kings of India. Weekly, if not daily, exposure to services, music, dances, etc. In praise and honor of the God incarnates, come, kings of India, resulted in the creation of a unique spiritual and emotional niche and vacuum among the forerunners of Rastafarians, okay? I'm gonna say it again. In praise and honor of the God incarnates of Hindu religion, right? Come kings of India resulted in the creation of a unique spiritual and emotional niche and vacuum among the forerunners of Rastafarians. Their minds searched and hearts craved an African potentate like Lord Rama or Krishna, just like Indian cricket fans wished for an Indian Michael Holden or Viv Richards. All right, they were looking for one in Africa. They needed a Krishna. You hear this? Lord Rama. They needed one in Africa. Joseph Hibbard, Howell's companion in St. Thomas, confirmed to Mansingh that after learning about the Hindu god incarnates, Rama, Krishna, and Buddha, Howell was convinced that every nation had its own god. Jesus for the whites, Rama, Krishna, Buddha for the Indians, and someone in Africa, about whom he did not know, for the Africans. All right, Dr. Haja, you see, they're turning all you guys into Africans, generalizing, assuming you're all African. When Rastafari was crowned, Hibbert told Mansingh, Africans realized that his title given to him by the whole world makes him a god, just like Ashoka, Buddha, Rama, Krishna. All right, you see what's going on? This is the origin, guys. After the coronation of Rastafari, Africans had a god king and a promised land. But when would they be allowed to go there? How will transform Christ's verse, my kingdom is not of this world, into a more practical, My kingdom is not of this time. Things do change, and Selassie's coronation would be the dawn of a new age. Like the Indians, Ethiopians now had a king of their race to whom they could look for salvation, any place in the world. Jai Rastafari. The Indian influence on Rastafari did not end with the foundation of Pinnacle. In Back O Wall, the western Kingston ghetto that became the main Rasta stronghold in the late 1950s, Indian elders were shown the same respect as Africans. What Africans dodged the hijack? Exchanges, reasonings took place around the chalice, the water-cooled coconut shell, ganja pipe, dreadlocks, which some Rasta elders remember as Sagavi, from the Hindi Jatawi. Alright, this is where they got the dreadlock thing from. Were possibly inspired by Indian sadhus, religious mendicants whose presence in Jamaica is confirmed by 1910 photographs. Alright, I've shown these photographs, I've shown even older ones from the 1800s, guys. Yes, these Hindu elders with long dreadlocks. Some prefer to relate dreadlocks to published photos of Selassie's tribal guards, the mountain lions, or to Maasai braid, but the Rastas' vegetarian diet likely has Hindi origins as well, since traditional Indian dietary science holds that ganja makes the body hypersensitive to toxins associated with alcohol and meat. Consequently, cannabis cultures like Indian and Rastafari tend to avoid these. Although the Indian influence was critical in its formative years, Rastafari later erased much of it from communal memory. Alright, you see what they did? They erased this part of the Rastafari origin. Howell and his contemporaries were world travelers and looked for global solutions. Ethiopia provided a spiritual nationality and a promised land, but the first Rastas drew from the wisdom of many nations. In later years, Afrocentrism prevailed among the Nyabingis, the Emmanuelites, Bobos, alright, African, Afrocentrism, alright, Pan-Africanism, and most of the small groups that formed the Back to Africa movement. These groups identified all strains of beneficial and positive thought with Africa and denied other influences, you see? And just to corroborate, I just want to show you guys there's a lot of studies on this. There's an article. There's here Indian Influences on Rastafarianism, a senior honors thesis by Vincent E. Burgess. So he presented this to the Ohio State University in 2007. It says here Project Advisor, Professor Hugh B. Urban, Department of Comparative Studies in the Humanities. As I'm reading this, I ran into this, and this article says Howell is believed to be the first to preach divinity of Haile Selassie, and his return to Jamaica is considered to mark the beginning of Rastafarianism. Howell's original 6 principles, according to Leonard Barrett, were hatred for the white race, alright? This is what I'm trying to explain to you. The complete superiority of the black race, revenge on whites for their wickedness, you want to blame the whites for everything, the negation, persecution, and humiliation of the government and legal bodies of Jamaica, preparation to go back to Africa, okay? Back to Africa. This Leonard Howell, the founder of Rastafarianism, acknowledgement Emperor Haile Selassie as the supreme being and only ruler of black people. All right, the 6 principles. So the article goes over the same things we just read about the Hindu influences on the founders of Rastafarianism, but it gets a little bit more detailed in a lot of parts. Again, it talks about his Hindu friend and how he gave him the name Gan Mara or Ganguru. All right, the original Gan. Says Lalo is also credited with the introduction of many mystical Hindu beliefs, practices, and language into Rastafarian philosophy and prayers. Early Rastafarian prayers contain many Hindi, Bengali, and Urdu words and are believed to have been chanted in Hindu mantra style. A popular early Rastafarian prayer begins Tu Allah Alpha, Tu Mata Edoku, Tu Ganguru Ru, Manaj Ane Jabu Novi Muso, Hal Ataga Garid. The above prayer was written phonetically in 1936 edition, The Daily Gleaner, and the man signs identified the Hindi word tu, you, mata, mother. They believed that Edoku was a misspelling of the Ye Deko, look here. Gangunguru, Leonard Howell's Hindi name, Manje, bag, ane, food, grain, jabu, when, halat, condition. They believed that Ataga was a misspelling of Atana so much, and that Garid was a misspelling of the Hindi Garib, poor. The Rastafarian use of the word Jah to refer to both God and Haile Selassie is popularly believed to have been biblical origins. All right, and then it goes on to talk about the word Jah again, letting you know that Mansan believes that it was originally derived from the Hindi term Jai, victory, and it almost makes sense the way Rastafarians say Jah Rastafari, like it's like proclamation of victory for real. The Mansans also believe that the Rastafarian adoption of vegetarian diet was a result of Hindu influence, as some Rastafarians hold to strict dietary restrictions known as ital, food in its essential natural state, and many Rastas abstain from alcohol, coffee, or processed teas. So even though some Rastas do eat meat, such as small fresh fish, pork and shellfish are expressly forbidden. Ital cuisine focuses on fresh fruits and vegetables, with one of the principal notions along with the absence of meat and alcohol. It is a complete lack of salt in the cooking process and very limited additional condiments, especially those which have been transformed from their natural states. It is said that a real true Rasta would choose the Ital diet, but he or she has no choice in the matter. If you are going to reach into life ever living, you must eat divinely of life ever living. Then it goes on to talking about ganja as a sacrament. Just like the Rastas, it was a sacrament for the sadhu priest. The ritual use of marijuana within Hinduism is seen most predominantly amongst the sadhus. Although not all sadhus use drugs, many of them do use intoxicants on a daily basis. The hallucinogens, marijuana, ganja, and hashish charas are by far the preferred intoxicants used in ritual. Other intoxicants used to a much lesser extent include opium, datura, and alcohol. The practice of smoking ganja is considered a type of sadhana, a method for attaining God realization, and the resultant intoxication is interpreted to be God's blessing, prasad. Amongst Saivite sadhus, ganja is often interpreted to be symbolic of stronger toxins and poisons, such as venom, which Shiva is said to have ingested. The belief is that Shiva was able to conquer such toxins via the mastery of yoga, and by using ganja, the sadhus are emulating the consciousness of Shiva. Ritualized use of marijuana, leading to a state of divine intoxication, affords the practitioner with the opportunity to strengthen their own yogic skills while simultaneously communicating with the divine. As explained earlier, marijuana was introduced to Jamaica by the Hindu workforce in the 1840s and quickly became popular amongst the Afro-Jamaican population. Indians were not only responsible for the introduction of marijuana to Jamaica, but the popular term ganja has Indian origins, and marijuana is also sometimes referred to as Kali. All right, Kali, that Kali weed, originally in honor of the goddess. A vast majority of the rural Afro-Jamaican population came to believe that ganja was an extremely beneficial substance. They saw it as possessing numerous healing spiritual and religious properties and therefore used it liberally from birth until death. Furthermore, Jamaican laborers thought that smoking marijuana built up their strength and allowed them to work longer, harder, and faster. Less than a decade after its introduction, ganja had assumed an important social, economic, cultural, and folk pharmacological status amongst the Afro-Jamaican population, right? So Dash the hijack with all the Afro stuff, a status it had for centuries held in India, all right, for centuries. Ganja became a popular ingredient in folk remedies. For example, Jamaican mothers would often steep marijuana in rum and offer it as a tonic to sick and teething children. Those Jamaicans adept at using ganja medicinally gained a certain amount of prestige and became known as bush doctors. Leonard Howell was believed to be practicing these techniques at his New York City tea room, where he was accused by Garveyites of being an obeahman for preparing ganja bang tonics. Remember that? We read that earlier. The role of ganja in Rastafarianism cannot be overemphasized. Marijuana is viewed as a natural product of the earth, a gift from God, and it is viewed as not only the most natural and direct route to communication with God and the Rastafari brethren, but is also used as an essential element in prayer and meditation. Ganja is the primary sacrament of Rastafarians, and its ritualized smoking is paramount to their way of life. Although the presence of ganja in Jamaica and its initial implementation as a religious sacrament can be traced directly back to India and Hindu rituals, Rastafarians today regularly defend the glories of ganja by citing Bible verses, the most popular of which are Genesis 1:29, and God said, Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of three yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat. All right, and then the wearing of locks, we already talked. Okay, just want to read that real quick so you guys can see. It's very deep. So again, as Charles Price says in his book Rastafari, The Evolution of a People and Their Identity, he says that Rastafari doctrine probably benefited from doctrinal diversity in its early years because the versions could speak to varied audiences whose members were ensconced in already established religious discourses. For example, Ethiopianists and black nationalists were interested in the idea of a black Messiah or God, and those who were close to Christianity were curious about the idea of Christ's return. The embryonic Rastafari doctrine was an amalgam of biblical lore, Ethiopianism, black nationalism, revival, Freemasonry, all right, Freemasonic ideas, and Gnosticism, Gnostic freewheeling. Each of these religious assemblages were partially utilized, combined, and sometimes conflicting ways, okay? That's what the origins of Rastafarianism is. And they also left out the Hindu religious influences. And to corroborate, Michael Barnett, he also said in his book, The Rastafari Movement, A North American and Caribbean Perspective, this year, according to Escrine, it was in Hines' King of Kings organization that the revivalist spirit was the strongest. Additionally, Hines' skillful merging of revivalism with Rastafari led to the wide-scale appeal of his organization. The carryovers of revivalism were very much evident in Hines' King of Kings mission, with feast, fast, and of course baptism. Along with these, there was also, of course, the introduction of new practices and beliefs, such as the celebration of Passover to remind the congregation that they were exiles in Babylon who sought to return to Ethiopia, as well as the introduction of Haile Selassie I as the messianic figure who would redeem black people all over the world from the shackles of colonialism and poverty. All right, they literally decided to make him Christ, the God in earth. A notable similarity between Hines and Howell's individual organization was the relatively high number of women in their congregations. This arguably was an outcome of the strong revivalist influence that was part and parcel of both Rastafari followings. According to Erskine, a key feature of revivalism is the preponderance of women in the congregations, and this characteristic was clearly transferred into the Rastafari organizations of Howell and Hines. Women were not only very much visible in Howell's Pinnacle community and Hines' King of Kings mission, but indeed were key players sharing important responsibilities for these Rastafari organizations with the men. When all is said and done, however, no matter how successful Hines was as a Rastafari preacher, with a congregation numbering almost 1,000, Leonard Howell had a membership of several thousand when he established his Pinnacle community in St. Catherine in 1940s. In this author's opinion, the huge, vibrant, independent Rastafari community that Howell was able to establish at Pinnacle essentially trumped Robert Hines' achievement when he broke out on his own. What is important about this critical appraisal of the emergence of Rastafari movement is the key assertion that three of its early preachers, Archibald Dunkley, Joseph Hibbard, and Leonard Howell, independently came to the conclusion that Haile Selassie I is divine. Robert Hines was in fact the only prominent early Rastafari preacher who went on record to say that Leonard Howell convinced him of Haile Selassie's divinity. Just like Leonard Howell, both Hibbard and Dunkley have the notoriety of being worldly, well-traveled individuals. Barrett writes that upon returning to Jamaica in 1931 from Costa Rica, Hibbert immediately started an Ethiopian Coptic ministry in Benoa, St. Andrew, where he preached Haile Selassie's divinity. It was only when he went to Kingston in early 1933 in an attempt to broaden his following that he met Leonard Howell, who himself was preaching that Haile Selassie is divine. Beyond this similarity, however, there are key doctrinal differences in the teachings of Howell and Hibbert. While Howell developed an ideological and theological orientation inspired both by Athley Rogers' Holy Pibby and Reverend Fitzvalentine Petersburg Royal Parchment Scroll of Black Supremacy, all right? You guys see the influence which he is able to synthesize as the promised key. Hibbert, as a consequence of his immersion in the ancient mystic order of Ethiopia, introduces a version of Rastafari teachings that is based unapologetically on Freemasonry. okay, on Freemasonry. These are your founders. This is their influences. This is the founders of Rastafariism. Again, Freemasonry, in addition to an interpretive analysis of an Ethiopic version of the Bible. Then it talks about Archibald Dunkley. All right, we got him already. And then it talks about the case of David and Annie Harvey, who founded a religious sect known as the Israelites in 1930, 1931. They were a Jamaican couple that had also traveled extensively, first meeting in Costa Rica, again, Costa Rica, where they got married. After leaving Costa Rica sometime after 1920, they traveled to Panama, Cuba, and then the United States. They returned to Jamaica in 1924, but stayed only a few months after suddenly feeling inspired to go to Ethiopia to live. They remained in Ethiopia for almost 6 years, observing the coronation of Haile Selassie I in 1930 at first hand before returning again to Jamaica. Importantly, they brought with them the picture of Haile Selassie that Leonard Howell ended up copying and using as postcards for his own purposes, according to Archibald Dunkley. In an interview with Hill, Dunkley, who dubs this photo the Prince of Peace photo, states that Howell went directly to the Israelites' headquarters at Paradise Street in Kingston on his return from New York and took hold of one of the photos of Haile Selassie. Dunkley comments that if they, the Harveys, did not believe in Rastafari, I do not think that they would bring the photograph of him and teach the people them of Africa, insinuating that in fact the Harveys were the first preachers of the divinity of Rastafari and not Howell. For this author, the matter that Dunkley raises is not something that should be considered lightly, and the Harveys could very well be serious contenders for the mantle of first Rastas, alongside Joseph Hibbert and some of the key revival organizations scattered around Jamaica, right? These are your people spreading the whole Rastafarianism. Of important note is that the developmental trajectory of Rastafarianism in Jamaica, so far as this author is concerned, is essentially the outcome of the growth of independent Rastafari communities, each of them influenced by one of the early first generation Rastafari leaders. Notably, despite the coexistence of various independent Rastafari groupings in the early years of its history, there were some cases of collaboration between the leaders, such as that between Archibald Dunkley and Joseph Hibbert. Dunkley was able to speak on Hibbert's platform on one or two occasions. However, he lacked Hibbert's Masonic background. All right, he didn't have the Master Mason title. Thus, unlike Hibbert, he restricted his teachings to ideas based on the King James Version of the Bible. Contrastingly, Hibbert, with his mystical orientation and Masonic discipline, proceeded to develop an Ethiopian Coptic church along orderly lines. Along with the King James I Bible, he used extracts of the Ethiopic Bible of Saint Sosimas, including the Ethiopia Daskalia Apostolic Constitution, which he had printed at his own expense by the Star Printery Kingston for the instruction of his followers. There was also, of course, the well-documented partnership between Leonard Howell and Robert Hines. So we're going to get some words from William David Spencer here in his book, Dread Jesus. So Google didn't give me all the pages. They cut out a lot of pages, but luckily I got this page right here, 14. Just want to read this paragraph right here. It says, after the rise of modern biblical criticism in the 1700s, scholars attempted to reconstruct the original vowels, guessing that A and E, the most common vowels, and ones able to be supported by the consonants, were the eliminated original vowels. The softer German pronunciation, Yahweh, rather than Yahweh, Dashtahaja, came to be employed by scholarship. In popular religion, an attempt to sound out the impossible combination of the vowels points for Adonai, with the consonants of the tetragrammation had produced a nonsensical rendering Jehovah. This occurred as far back as the 1600s in the formative years of the King James Version, and that reading lent itself to such movements as the Jehovah's Witnesses in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We have noted two early founders of Rastafari, H. Archibald Dunkley and Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert, were members of the secret Egyptian Masonic order. Both of them, you see, Dunkley was a Mason. Both of them were. The Great Ancient Brotherhood of Silence or Ancient Mystic Order of Ethiopia. Okay, both were what? Members of the secret Egyptian Masonic order, just like Druid, an Egyptian ancient secret Masonic order the Great Ancient Brotherhood of Silence, or Ancient Mystic Order of Ethiopia. The Masons had consciously adopted the name Jah from Psalm 68:4 and built it into their composite name for God, Ju-Bu Long. As Mason Malcolm C. Duncan explained in his manual Duncan's Masonic Ritual and Monitor, the ritual of giving the grand omnific royal arch word is concluded by three Masons raising their right hands above their heads and giving in a low breath the words Jah-Bu Lon, Jehovah God, the pronunciation of the syllables being divided between them. Duncan details in the following note an Eastern origin for this composite name, an influence that we will see in later chapters has carried over to a strong segment of Rastafarian Christology, okay? And one last thing I want to read here, guys, before we go, is this article real quick. This is going to lead into a future video. What are the origins of the Hebrew Israelites? It says, I saw you disappear with my own eyes. Hidden transcripts of New York Black Israelite Bricolage by Jacob S. Dorman. So we're going to belly flop to a part of this book related to our video today. But we're going to read this whole article probably in another video regarding a rabbi here, Rabbi Matthew. Full name, Rabbi Wentworth Arthur Matthew. It says here that Rabbi Matthew in 1930 changed his practice to be closer to formative Judaism, but he also retained esoteric religious practices that were holdovers from the era of the Black mystics, all right, who coalesced around the Marcus Garvey movement in the 1920s. All these mystics, huh? One of the most important of these was a Garveyite named Bishop John Hickerson, who also went by the names the Reverend St. Bishop Divine and Bishop Eshel Ben Dove. Before coming to Harlem, Hickerson had lived and collaborated with George Baker, the future Father Divine, in Baltimore. There they developed a New Thought-based doctrine that God dwelt inside the individual. New Thought was a philosophy of positive thinking that had developed in 19th century New England, in which thought, according to Jill Watts, that God existed in all people, that the channeling of God's Spirit eradicated problems, and that unity with God guaranteed salvation. In 1914, Hickerson founded the Church of the Living God, the pillar and ground of the truth in Harlem, identified himself as an Ethiopian, all right? He was an Ethiopianist, all right? You guys see the whole connection? Everybody has the similar background, right? Starting all these movements, and taught a variation of a new thought. One of his chants was God in you, God in me, you God, I God, everybody be God. Hickerson's students showed a similar pattern of New Thought beliefs. Elder Warren Robertson, aka Robertson, founded a Black Israelite group in Harlem in 1917 called the Ever Live and Never Die Society, all right, a Black Israelite group, or simply the Black Jews. Hickerson claimed that he had taught Hebrew to Arnold Josiah Ford, and that Ford had then taught Matthew everything he knows about Hebrew. The fact that Matthew picked the same long, compound name for his church also indicates his debt to the New Thought Israelite lineage that ran through Hickerson. The association between Judaism and New Thought that Hickerson helped to establish can be seen in his most famous associate, Father Divine, whose reputedly Jewish doctrine was simply God is within man. In sum, Hickerson helped to spread the New Thought idea that God dwelled inside charismatic leaders and their followers, a concept that was at the heart of the Jewish Hebrew or Black Israelite beliefs of his followers and associates, both famous and obscure. This Black Israelite New Thought theology was based on the works of French-American author and publisher William Laurent de Lawrence, okay, who made his name by translating and publishing magical works from around the Oriental world. His books have been widely circulated and remain highly respected among practitioners of Afro-Atlantic religions such as Santeria and Voodoo. De Laurence's work played critical roles in the genesis of 20th century alternative African American religions such as the Moorish Science Temple, listen, Black Islam, okay? Listen to this. This is deep, guys. Rabbi Matthew's Black Judaism, and Leonard Howell's Rastafarianism, okay? This French American, our so-called French Laurent de Lawrence, translating these Oriental magical works, influencing all these movements. The central theme in the Lawrence introductions and glosses, like the central theme in the beliefs of Bishop Hickerson, Father Divine, and Rabbi Matthew, is the new thought concept of the immanence of God. De Lawrence favored biblical quotations such as, "The kingdom of God is within you. You are the temple of the living God. The Father is in me, I in him, and we in you," all of which are strikingly similar to Father Divine's slogans and the teachings of the esoteric religious practitioners who studied the Lawrence books. All right, esoteric. Rabbi Matthew used the Lawrence writings to create magical rituals and a Hebraic creed that followed him to be filled with God's Spirit. Matthew based what he called his Kabbalistic science on the most popular of the Lawrence books, the 6 and 7 books of Moses. All right, and we're going to end it here in this article, really good article. We're going to get it from the beginning to end in another video. We're talking about the origin of these Hebrew Israelite groups. Who is this Hickerson? Who are these people? But I want you to see how it influenced Leonard Howell, right? He went to the United States. He got influenced by all these movements and groups and his own knowledge of the Hindu culture and all that. You guys got to see how this all started, but it was based on a Pan-Africanist, Afrocentric idea. What does it mean, mystic? It says here, spiritually allegorical, pertaining to mysteries of faith. Mystique, mysterious, full of mystery, or directly from Latin mysticos, mystical, mystic of secret rites. Source of also of Italian mystico, Spanish mystico from Greek mystikos, secret, mystic, connected within the mysteries. From mystes, one who has been initiated. One who has been initiated, mystic. You're part of an order. You're part of a Freemasonic group. Mystic, noun, exponent of mystical theology, one who accepts or preaches some form of mysticism. 1670s, from mystic. In Middle English, the noun meant symbolic meaning, interpretation. Okay? Mystic. As it says here, so Rasta, tell me, are you a Mason? I didn't write this, okay? It says here, now the controversy on this issue runs deep, mainly because at Rastafari's roots, its initiators were at one time a part of Masonic lodges, but not in the sense of today's mainstream Freemasonry. We'll touch on this later in the presentation. Accreditation, due to what Rastafari knows as the Gong, or Leonard Percival Howell, is known as the first Rasta, all right? Howell made clean and clear statements of the salvation of the descendants of African slaves, thus the hijack in the Western Hemisphere was the life of their redemption only if they returned to the roots, spiritually, mentally, ultimately, physically to their origin. Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert, Archibald Dunkley, and Robert Hines were 3 individuals who had ties into Freemasonic lodges that were Prince Hall affiliated, okay? Prince Hall Masons affiliated, but in lieu of their individual epiphanies, they seem to even find themselves in search of a new truth, or so to speak, even from the confines of Freemasonic thought. I'm going to read from this article real quick from the Comitas Institute for Anthropological Study, or CIFAS. It says here, the Rastafari Movement in Kingston, Jamaica, by M.G. Smith, with R. Augier and R.M. Nettleford, published by Institute of Social and Economic Research, University College of the West Indies. Just want to read, I'm going to belly flop to this part of the article. It says, we have now to go back a few years to introduce a musical note. Until 1930, revivalism, Pocomania, and Zion, all right, had a ritual monopoly among the Jamaican folk, rural and urban. This cult, described by Professor George E. Simpson, 1956, Jamaican Revivalist Cults, Social and Economic Studies, Volume 5, was frankly polytheistic and stressed an autocratic leadership of small competing groups. Revival, which spread throughout Jamaica after the Great Revival of 1861, had displaced earlier tribal cults, only one of which, the Kumina of St. Thomas and West Kingston, still retained its original form, right, in St. Thomas. A comparative study of acculturation in Morant Bay and West Kingston Like Kumina, revival stressed spirit possession, and sought this through the dance and the drums. All right, this is one of the big influences for the early creation of Rastafarism. Simpson's studies occurred on the eve of major changes in Jamaican folk religion. Since 1953, revival or Pocomania has steadily lost ground before expanding American Protestant missions, especially the Church of God movement, financed originally from the United States, where there were many flourishing Pocomania tabernacles in Kingston. There are now relatively few. Those people who originally practiced or preached revival have either joined the Church of God, lost faith, moved elsewhere, or drifted in the direction of the monotheistic, multi-sided Rastafari creed. So many of these people converted and became Rastas. So one other thing I want to show, another influence to something in the Rastafari culture and terminology, is the phrase I and I. There's actually a lot of studies on this. This is one article speaking about it. It says here, pronominal I, Rastafari, and the lexicon of the New Testament, with special reference to Paul's epistle to the Romans by Delano Vincent Palmer. Just going to read this briefly. Anyone familiar with the Rastafari movement and its connection with the Bible is struck by the prevalence of I locution found in them both, because the phenomenon is important in the canonical testaments, more so the New. This is from the New Testament, okay? This study seeks to investigate its significance in certain epistolary pieces, Romans 7 and 14 to 25, 15, 14 to 33, the bio narratives and apocalypse in their historical and cultural milieu. The next stage of the investigation then compares the findings of the aforementioned New Testament books with corresponding statements of the Rasta community to determine their relevance for the ongoing Anglophone theological discussion. In this connection, the following questions are addressed. What are the intertextual links and functions of the I statements in Romans? How do they relate to similar Dominical sayings? And 3, can any parallel be established between the language of Rastafari and these? In sum, the study seeks to bring into critical dialogue the permutative I of the New Testament with the self-understanding of Rastafari. All right, so pretty good article if you want to get into it. I just want to show you another influence for one of the terms used by the Rastas. Again, a lot of it has religious Christian background, and as you guys can see, New Testament influence. All right, guys, I think I'm going to end it right there. I hope you guys enjoyed the reading, another look at the whole Rastafari movement, the origins of it, the founders, who they were, what they believed in, what backgrounds they had. As you guys can see, there's a lot of religious views involved, Hinduism, Christianity, esoteric stuff, Masonic stuff, and very Afrocentric. It's literally a Pan-Africanist agenda telling everybody they're Africans, and its origin was excluding so-called white people. Well, I hope I presented enough information for you guys to do your own conclusions on it. You see its foundations back in the 1920s. We're in 2023. We're literally almost 100 years later, guys. It's really time to wake up, because it's MHOE, Most High over everything. Not mystics, Shriners, revivalists, preachers, or men. That's just my opinion on it. I hope if you're new to my channel and you saw this whole presentation that you are able to take the time to catch up to my other presentations so you can see how wrong this whole Afrocentric, Pan-Africanist, Marcus Garveyite, Back to Africa movements are. That is not a true history. And it just seems all these people that started all these movements, so-called black movements, came from the same background, had their personal agendas, were almost like gatekeepers telling you to look to Africa, grabbing so many different teachings and religions and esoteric teachings and creating their religious movements, targeting the poor, oppressed people. So of course they related to it when it came to fighting the oppressors or colonial powers. Thanks for sticking around and hearing me read again, guys. I actually got Leonard Percival Howell's genealogy done. I got his family tree, and surprisingly, a lot of things kept popping up. And I'm going to show you there was no Africans. I'm going to show you that a lot of his lines actually go back to Europe. So look out for that video. It's coming soon. Now, before I go today, guys, like I told you in the beginning, you know, I grew up immersed in the whole Rasta culture. So being immersed in this culture, of course, I liked reggae roots. I followed a lot of reggae artists. One of my very first videos, or the first video I uploaded on my channel, was an interview I did with Capleton. Yeah, Capleton, the reggae artist, the fireman, someone who many would consider a true Rastaman. So I asked Capleton back then, this was literally about 6 to 8 years ago. I asked Capleton, what is a true Rastaman? And this is the answer he gave me. What I want to point out is why I related to the culture. As you're going to see, he's going to mention a lot of things that have nothing to do with being from Africa or just about worshiping Haile Selassie, even though he does mention that. And of course, this is an Afrocentric movement, so it's obviously part of the doctrine. But he literally goes over much of it that it's just about being righteous. And I can dig with that and following the Most High. So those parts I related to. Growing up in oppressed conditions made me relate to the whole struggle of fighting colonial powers. So we're going to do a little throwback real quick before we leave today. We're going to see Kurimeo back 6, 7, 8 years ago. Here we go.
When I say Jah, you say Rastafari.
Aquí estamos con el Fireman Capleton trayéndonos su música, su fuego, su mensaje.
I mean, we're just bringing in the message, bringing in the love, you know what I mean, and bringing in that energy, bringing in that fire, fuego, you know what I mean, bringing that vibe. Well, a true Rastaman is just, you know, believe in yourself, you know what I mean, stay true to the thing, you know what I mean, stand up for equal rights and justice.
So believe in yourself and stand up for equal rights and justice. I can relate to that, all right? You dig me so far?
Stand up for salvation. Always remember that the infant cared for, you know what I mean, the sick nourished, you know what I mean, help the weak, you know what I mean, always be faithful, you know what I mean, stand up for salvation.
So stand up for salvation, look out for the children, look out for the sick, misinfortuned. Again, I can dig all that. This is why I personally related, and many people relate to the whole Rasta culture. And what I wanted to show you today is that its foundation, its founders, had a whole different idea. Remember, I showed you earlier the 6 principles that Leonard Howell would teach people. Let's keep hearing Capleton. What is a true Rastaman?
Stand up for redemption, you know what I mean? Preach love, preach unity, you know what I mean? Uphold the liberty and the principle of his people.
So preach love and preach unity. I can dig that. Now he's talking about uphold the principles of his Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie. And that was one of the principles that I was saying Leonard Howard taught people, that you have to worship Haile Selassie, all right? So of course he's going to mention that.
Majesty, you know, Rastafari are about Nyabingi, you know, Bobo Shanti, Orthodox, 12 tribe of Israel, you know.
So Orthodox Christianity, Bobo Shanti, that's all these stuff that came in the 1800s. And now he says the 12 tribes of Israel. That I can dig on. You see what I'm saying? But when it comes to the original foundation, they don't mention none of that. They don't say, oh, we got influence from the Old Testament. We read what influenced Leonard Percival Howell to create the whole Rastafarian movement.
And, you know, just be real and just be positive and, you know, just be who you are, you know what I mean, and stand up for what you believe in, you know what I mean?
So be real and be positive. And again, I can relate to that. So I hope you guys heard everything he said. What is a true Rastaman? And that was in Capleton's opinions. Apart from the Selassie and the Bobo Shanti stuff, I can relate with everything else. And all those things that I could relate to are not exclusive to Rastas. You don't have to be a Rastafari to practice that stuff. I know that now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, more fire, and it's all about the blessing, you know what I mean? Prosperity for the people, you know what I mean? Liberation, salvation, redemption, repatriation, you know what I mean? Restoration, self-esteem, self-awareness, self-reliance, self-thought, self-control, discipline, humility, tolerance, diligence, simplicity. Be yourself, know who you are, know where you're coming from in order to know where you're going. Never be a traitor or sell out to your heritage or your culture, your philosophy or your curriculum. Be obedient to your parent and your guardian. Go to school, get your education. Be educated, re-educated as well. You know what I mean? And always remember that the ultimate is self-determination. Believe in you, believe in yourself. Never let no one tell you cannot make it in life. You know what I mean? Have a direction, you know what I mean? Keep your focus. Be courageous, know what your goals are. Reach out for them. More fire.
All right, guys. So that last statement he made, that was deep. And again, all that has nothing to do with joining the Rastafarian movement and becoming a Rastafari. He said one important thing just now. He said, educate yourself and re-educate yourself. Never stop learning. Don't get stuck in these doctrines and movements. You have to keep re-educating yourself. So I take advice when I hear it. I understand that in a deeper way. You got to keep re-educating yourself because there's always new information coming out. And all these founders, all these movements weren't always in the best interest of everybody. And that's okay if we were part of it. But as he said, you have to re-educate yourself. And if you do re-educate yourself with the new information that we're receiving these days, you will see this whole movement has been Pan-Africanist. And all these founders are coming from the same background. Many were mystics, many Freemasonic, Gnostics, preachers and Christians, religious mind state people. Shout out to the fireman. He was a great person to be around. I met him 3 times, very humble, and he recognized the real in me right away without me even having to say anything. He did this interview with passion. It's time to re-educate ourselves, as he said. And hopefully these elders, with much love and respect, take their own advice and see how they separated them from their indigenous American roots and their Black European roots. We got a lot of Irish, Scottish, and English. Got prisoners of war, Jacobites, all that in you. But turning everything into Afrocentric blinded you from your true heritage. Again, thanks for sticking around to the end. Hope you guys enjoyed this presentation. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Hawa.